Jake Martinez walked through the curved hallways of Zentari Prime Academy with his heart beating fast. The walls around him glowed with a soft blue light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. He had been on this alien world for 3 weeks now, but still felt like he was in a dream that might end at any moment. The other students moved past him in the corridor, like creatures from his childhood imagination. A group of Altarians floated by without making any sound, their tall, thin bodies seeming to bend light around them as they moved. Their skin looked like it was made of starlight and their eyes were huge and silver. Jake tried not to stare, but found it impossible to look away completely. Behind them came 2 Vortex students, their bodies made of what looked like living crystal. They made soft chiming sounds as they walked, like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. The light from the walls caught in their translucent forms and threw rainbow patterns on the floor. Jake had never seen anything so beautiful and strange at the same time. A Kefri student slithered past him next, its dozen tentacles moving in perfect coordination. The creature's skin changed colors as it moved, shifting from deep purple to pale green to warm orange. Jake had learned that these color changes showed emotions, but he still could not read what any of the colors meant. Jake looked down at his own hands and felt very ordinary. His brown skin and simple human form seemed so plain compared to the amazing variety of life around him. He wore the standard academy uniform, a gray jumpsuit that fit all species, but on him it just looked like regular clothes. On the aliens, the same uniform seemed to transform into something elegant and otherworldly. He checked his schedule display again. Advanced Xenobiology with Professor Zethkar. Room 347B. Jake had been looking forward to this class since he arrived. Biology was his favorite subject back on Earth, and the chance to study alien life forms was like a dream come true. The classroom was larger than any lecture hall Jake had seen on Earth. The ceiling stretched up into darkness, and the walls curved in impossible ways that made his eyes water if he looked too long. Students from 12 different species filled the room, each group sitting in specially designed seats that matched their body types. Jake found an empty seat near the middle of the room. The chair adjusted itself to fit his human form, which still amazed him every time it happened. Around him, other students settled into their places with the fluid grace that seemed to come naturally to all non-human species. Veltara, an Altarian student, sat 2 seats away from Jake. She had been friendly to him during orientation, though Jake suspected she felt sorry for him more than anything else. Her species was known for their kindness to less developed races. She turned her silver eyes toward him and nodded in greeting. Krex, a Vortex student, occupied a crystal platform designed for his species near the front of the room. His body hummed with a low musical note that Jake had learned meant contentment. Krex was brilliant at theoretical physics, but seemed confused by biological sciences. He had asked Jake several times how organic life could function without proper geometric structure. Silanth, a Kefri student, had arranged her tentacles in a complex pattern that Jake knew meant she was nervous about the upcoming lesson. Her skin flickered between deep blue and pale yellow, colors that showed worry in her species. She had been studying xenobiology for 3 years and was considered one of the best students in the program. The classroom fell silent as Professor Zethkar entered through a door that Jake had not noticed before. The professor was an insectoid, standing nearly 8 feet tall on 4 legs that moved with mechanical precision. His compound eyes reflected the room's light in thousands of tiny rainbows, and his mandibles clicked together as he prepared to speak. "Welcome, students, to today's advanced xenobiology session," Professor Zethkar said in the clicking musical language that the Academy's translation system converted into words Jake could understand. "Today we will be conducting a live specimen study." Jake felt excitement run through him like electricity. A live specimen study meant they would actually see and examine a real alien creature, not just look at pictures or read about them in textbooks. This was exactly the kind of hands-on learning he had hoped for when he applied for the exchange program. Around him, the other students began to shift in their seats. Jake noticed that their movements seemed different from the excited stirring he expected. Veltara's starlight skin grew dimmer, and her silver eyes widened. Krex's crystal form began to emit a deeper, more worried tone. Silintha's tentacles curled closer to her body, and her skin turned a solid dark blue. Jake looked around the room with growing confusion. The other students seemed nervous, almost afraid. He wondered if there was something about live specimen studies that he had missed in his orientation materials. Maybe the translation system had not explained something important about the procedures. Professor Zethkar continued his introduction, his mandibles clicking with what Jake assumed was professional enthusiasm. Live specimens provide opportunities for observation and analysis that recorded materials simply cannot match. The direct study of living organisms allows us to understand behavior, biology, and ecological relationships in ways that no other method can provide. The professor's compound eyes swept across the room, taking in each student's reaction. When his gaze reached Jake, the clicking of his mandibles seemed to pause for just a moment. Jake thought he saw something like surprise or curiosity in those thousands of tiny eye segments, but with insectoid expressions being so different from human ones, he could not be sure. I trust that all students have reviewed the safety protocols for this type of study, Professor Zethkar continued. The procedures we will follow today are standard for all accredited xenobiology programs throughout the galaxy. Jake nodded. Along with the other students, though he realized he could not remember reading anything specific about live specimen safety in his preparation materials. He assumed that the protocols would be explained when they were needed, just like in his biology classes back on Earth. The professor moved toward a control panel near the front of the room, his 4 legs carrying him with smooth efficiency. Today's specimen comes from a world that presents unique challenges for biological study. The creature we will examine has evolved in an environment that most species would consider extremely hostile. Jake felt his excitement growing even stronger. Hostile environments produced the most interesting adaptations, and he was eager to see what kind of creature had evolved under such conditions. This was going to be the best class he had attended since arriving at the academy. The heavy doors at the back of the classroom slid open with a deep rumbling sound that Jake felt in his chest. 2 security officers stepped through, their bodies completely covered in thick armor that looked like it could stop a missile. The armor was matte black with glowing red strips along the joints, and their helmets covered their faces completely. Jake could not tell what species they were underneath all that protection. Between them, they pushed a containment unit that was bigger than Jake had expected. The container was made of some kind of metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Thick cables ran from the unit to a power source that hummed with barely contained energy. Warning symbols in dozens of different languages covered every surface of the container, and Jake could see at least 3 different locking mechanisms holding it shut. The security officers moved with careful, measured steps, as if they were carrying something that might explode at any moment. Their armor made soft mechanical sounds as they walked, and Jake noticed that other students were pressing themselves back in their seats as the container passed by. Professor Zethkar's mandibles clicked in what Jake was beginning to recognize as approval. "Excellent timing," the professor said to the security officers. "Please position the containment unit in the center of the room where all students can observe clearly." The officers nodded and carefully maneuvered the container into position. Jake could see that they never took their hands off their weapons, even while moving the heavy unit. Whatever was inside must be very dangerous for them to be so careful. As the container settled into place, Jake heard something move inside it. The sound was like claws scraping against metal, followed by a low growling that made his skin tingle. The noise was not loud, but it carried a quality that made every student in the room sit up straighter. "Today's specimen," Professor Zethkar announced, "is a Nexus stalker from the volcanic world of Pyros 7. The professor's compound eyes gleamed as he spoke. "This creature represents one of the most successful predator adaptations in the galaxy." Jake felt his excitement spike. A real alien predator right here in the classroom. He leaned forward in his seat to get a better view of the containment unit. Around him, he noticed that the other students were doing the opposite, pressing back. In their chairs, as if trying to get as far away as possible, Professor Zethkar continued his explanation while the security officers checked the container's systems. Nexus stalkers have evolved on a world where volcanic activity creates constant environmental challenges. The surface temperature averages 200 degrees Celsius, and the atmosphere contains sulfur compounds that would be lethal to most species. The professor moved to a display screen that showed images of Pyros VII. Jake saw a landscape of flowing lava, toxic clouds, and jagged rocks that glowed with internal heat. It looked like a vision of hell, but Professor Zethkar spoke about it with scientific enthusiasm. The creatures that survive in such an environment must be incredibly adaptable and resilient, the professor explained. Nexus stalkers have developed claws that can cut through volcanic glass, saliva that contains powerful acids, and muscle density that allows them to leap distances of up to 50 meters. Jake heard Valtara make a soft sound that might have been fear. Her starlight skin had grown so dim that she was barely visible, and her silver eyes were wide with what Jake was starting to recognize as genuine terror. He looked around the room and saw similar reactions from the other students. Krex's crystal form had changed from its usual clear blue to a deep red that Jake had never seen before. The musical humming from his body had become a discordant whine that made Jake's teeth ache. Scylla had pulled all her tentacles close to her body and turned a solid black color that Jake knew meant extreme distress. The specimen we have today, Professor Zethkar continued, is classified as a moderate threat level creature according to galactic safety standards. This means it requires level 3 containment protocols and appropriate protective measures for all observers. At these words, the other students began reaching under their seats for equipment that Jake had not noticed before. Valtara pulled out a device that looked like a belt made of light, which she wrapped around her waist. Immediately, a shimmering barrier appeared around her, like heat waves rising from hot pavement. Krex activated something that made his crystal form glow brighter and harder, as if he had become a living diamond. The musical sound from his body changed to a steady, defensive tone that reminded Jake of a warning siren. Scylla extended her tentacles to touch a series of controls on her chair, and suddenly she was surrounded by what looked like a bubble of thick liquid. Jake could still see her through it, but she seemed to be floating in some kind of protective gel. All around the room, students were activating similar protective devices. Energy shields, armor plating, environmental suits, and barriers that Jake did not recognize, but which all seemed designed to keep dangerous things away from their users. Jake looked under his own seat and found nothing. He raised his hand to get Professor Zethkar's attention, confusion growing in his mind. "Professor, I think there might be a mistake. I don't have any protective equipment." The professor's compound eyes focused on Jake, and his mandibles clicked in what Jake was beginning to think might be amusement. "Surely a Deathworlder needs no introduction to basic predator safety protocols," Professor Zethkar said. "Your species' natural adaptations should provide adequate protection for this level of threat." Jake felt even more confused. Deathworlder was a term he had heard other students use when talking about him, but he had never understood what it meant. He assumed it was just another way of saying he was from Earth, which was apparently unusual in some way. The other students were staring at him now, their various forms of protection making them look like they were preparing for war. Through Valtara's energy shield, Jake could see her silver eyes wide with what looked like disbelief. Krex's crystal form was ringing like a bell, and Scylla's tentacles were moving in agitated patterns inside her protective bubble. "Is the human not going to shield himself?" Valtara whispered to Krex, her voice barely audible through her barrier. Krex's response was a musical sound that Jake's translator converted as pure amazement. "Perhaps Deathworlders do not fear what terrifies the rest of us." Jake looked around the room at all the protective equipment and began to wonder if he had misunderstood something important about this class. The way everyone was acting, it seemed like they expected the creature to break free and attack them. But that was impossible, right? This was a classroom, not a combat zone. Professor Zethkar moved to the containment unit's control panel, his 4 legs carrying him with purpose. "Now, let us begin our examination of this fascinating specimen." His mandibles clicked as he reached for the release controls. Please observe carefully as we activate the viewing ports. The tension in the room grew so thick that Jake could almost feel it pressing against his skin. Every student except him was now protected behind barriers, shields, or armor. Jake sat in his normal chair, wearing his normal clothes, feeling very much like he was missing something important, the professor's. Hand moved toward the first control, and Jake heard the containment unit begin to hum with power. Professor Zethkar's hand reached the first control on the containment unit, and Jake heard the system begin to power up with a deep humming sound. The viewing ports, which had been solid black, began to turn transparent as energy flowed through. The container systems. Jake leaned forward in his seat, eager to see his first alien predator up close. The lights in the room flickered once, then twice. Jake noticed but did not think much of it. Power fluctuations happen sometimes in the old buildings back on Earth too. But around him, the alien students began to shift nervously behind their protective barriers, through the transparent viewing port. Jake caught his first glimpse of the Nexus Stalker. The creature was about the size of a mountain lion, but its body was built like nothing Jake had ever seen. Its skin looked like black leather mixed with metal scales, and it moved with a fluid grace that reminded him of water flowing over rocks. 6 legs supported its muscular frame, each ending in claws that gleamed like polished knives. The creature's head was elongated and predatory, with eyes that glowed a deep red in the containment unit's artificial light. Its mouth was filled with teeth that looked sharp enough to cut through steel, and Jake could see drops of something that might have been saliva falling from its jaws and sizzling when they hit the floor of the container. Magnificent, Professor Zethkar clicked, his mandibles moving with academic excitement. Notice the adaptive features that allow survival in extreme volcanic environments. The reinforced skeletal structure, the heat-resistant integument, the specialized sensory organs adapted for detecting thermal variations. Jake was fascinated. The creature moved with a deadly beauty that reminded him of the big cats he had seen in nature documentaries, but everything about it was alien and strange. Its breathing created small puffs of steam in the cooler air of the containment unit, and its red eyes seemed to track movement outside the transparent walls. The lights flickered again, longer this time. Jake heard the containment unit's power system make a sound like a cough, and the humming changed pitch slightly. Professor Zethkar's compound eyes focused on the control panel, and his mandibles clicked with what Jake thought might be concern. Minor power fluctuation, the professor announced to the class. Nothing to be concerned about. The backup systems will compensate automatically. But as he spoke, the lights went out completely for 3 full seconds. When they came back on, they were dimmer than before, and Jake could hear the building's power system struggling to maintain stable energy flow. The containment unit's humming became irregular, like a car engine that was about to stall. The Nexus Stalker inside the container seemed to sense the change in its environment. The creature's red eyes grew brighter, and it began to move around the small space with increased agitation. Its claws scraped against the metal walls, creating a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard, but much louder and more threatening. Valtara's voice came through her energy shield, high and worried. Professor, perhaps we should postpone the demonstration until the power systems are fully stable. Professor Zethkar's mandibles clicked dismissively. The containment protocols have multiple redundancies. Even in the unlikely event of a primary system failure, the backup barriers will maintain full security. As if the universe wanted to prove him wrong, the lights flickered again and stayed dim. The containment unit's humming stopped completely. For a moment, then restarted with a sound like grinding metal. Jake saw the transparent viewing ports begin to flicker between clear and opaque, and he heard the security officers behind him begin to move. The Nexus Stalker threw itself against the wall of its container, and Jake heard a sound like thunder. The creature's claws left deep scratches in the metal, and its acidic saliva began to eat into the walls where it touched. The beast's red eyes were now blazing with an intensity that made Jake's skin crawl. Professor, one of the security officers, called out, his voice muffled by his helmet. We're reading system failures across all primary containment barriers. Recommend immediate evacuation protocols. Professor Zethkar moved to the control panel with quick, urgent steps. His forelegs carried him faster than Jake had ever seen him move, and his mandibles were clicking rapidly in what Jake now recognized as serious worry. Backup systems should be engaging automatically. The creature cannot possibly escape from a level 3 containment unit. The power went out again, and this time Jake could hear the building's emergency generators struggling to come online. When the lights returned, they were emergency lighting only, casting red shadows throughout the classroom that made everything look like a scene from a horror movie. The containment unit made a sound like a dying whale, followed by a series of sharp cracks. Jake watched in growing alarm as the transparent viewing ports began to develop spiderweb patterns of fractures. The Nexus Stalker seemed to understand what was happening because it began throwing itself against the weakening barriers with increased fury. "Evacuation protocols now," the security officer shouted, no longer bothering to be polite. "All students to emergency exits immediately." The alien students began to panic. Veltara's energy shield flickered and wavered as her terror affected its power supply. Krex's crystal form was ringing like a cracked bell, and the protective gel around Selenth was churning like a storm-tossed ocean. Students throughout the room were abandoning their seats and moving toward the exits with the desperate speed of creatures fleeing a natural disaster. Jake remained in his seat, watching the containment unit with fascination rather than fear. He had never seen anything like this before, and his curiosity was stronger than any worry about danger. The creature was beautiful in a deadly way, and he wanted to understand how it moved and thought. The first barrier failed with a sound like breaking glass. The Nexus Stalker's claws punched through the transparent wall, and Jake could see the creature's head pushing through the opening. Its red eyes swept the room, looking for threats or prey, and its acidic saliva dripped onto the classroom floor. Where it began to eat through the metal, the second barrier held for exactly 4 seconds, before the creature's strength overwhelmed it. Now only the final containment wall stood between the Nexus Stalker and the classroom full of students. Jake could see the beast's muscles bunching as it prepared for one final assault on its prison. Professor Zethkar was frantically working at the control panel, his mandibles clicking so fast they sounded like a machine gun. The security officers had their weapons drawn and were shouting orders that Jake could not understand over the noise of alarms and panicking students. The Nexus Stalker drew back, gathered itself, and launched its full weight against the final barrier. The wall exploded outward in a shower of metal fragments and sparks. The creature landed in the center of the classroom, free and very angry. Its red eyes swept the room and focused on the nearest target. Jake Martinez, sitting calmly in his chair, watching the magnificent predator with the same expression he might use to observe an interesting bird outside his window. The Nexus Stalker's lips pulled back to reveal its terrible teeth, and it began to move toward Jake with the fluid grace of a natural-born killer. The Nexus Stalker crouched low against the classroom floor, its 6 legs spread wide for maximum stability. Its red eyes locked onto Jake with the focused intensity of a hunter that had found its prey. The creature's acidic saliva dripped steadily onto a metal floor, creating small pools of hissing liquid that ate through the surface like water through sugar. Jake felt his heart rate increase, but not with panic. Instead, he experienced the same calm alertness that had kept him alive during encounters with bears and mountain lions back in Colorado. His father had taught him that predators could smell fear, and that the worst thing to do when facing a dangerous animal was to run or show weakness. The alien students around him were doing exactly what his father had warned against. Veltara had dropped her energy shield completely and was phasing in and out of visibility in her terror. Her starlight skin flickered like a broken hologram, and she was making high-pitched sounds that Jake's translator could not convert into words. Krex's crystal form was vibrating so violently that pieces of his body were starting to chip off and fall to the floor. The musical humming that usually came from his species had become a discordant wail that hurt Jake's ears. Several other Vorthix students had already shattered their protective barriers and were crawling toward the exits on fractured limbs. Selenth's Protective gel had burst like a soap bubble, leaving her tentacles writhing in panic. Her skin had turned a color that Jake had never seen before, a sickly yellow-green that his translator suggested meant mortal terror. She was trying to squeeze herself under her chair, but her tentacles were too thick to fit in the small space. The security officers were shouting orders in languages that Jake did not recognize, but their tone was universal. They wanted everyone to evacuate immediately. Their weapons were drawn and pointed at the Nexus stalker, but Jake noticed that their hands were shaking inside their armor. Professor Zethkar was still at the control panel, his forelegs moving in rapid circles as he tried to activate emergency protocols that no longer existed. His mandibles were clicking so fast they sounded like a typewriter, and Jake could see drops of something that might have been sweat falling from his compound eyes. The Nexus stalker took a step toward Jake, its claws clicking against the metal floor. The creature moved with the fluid grace of water flowing downhill, each movement perfectly balanced and controlled. Jake found himself admiring the way its muscles worked beneath its scaled skin. The efficiency of its predatory design. Behind the creature, Jake could see students fleeing through the emergency exits. Some were running, others were flying, and a few were teleporting directly through the walls. The classroom was emptying rapidly, but Jake remained in his seat, watching the approaching predator with calm interest. The Nexus stalker paused about 10 feet away from Jake, its head tilted slightly to one side. Its red eyes studied him with an intelligence that Jake had not expected. The creature seemed confused by his lack of fear, as if it had never encountered prey that did not run or fight or show terror. Jake slowly stood up from his chair, moving with the same careful control that his father had taught him for approaching wild animals. He kept his hands visible and his posture relaxed, avoiding any sudden movements that might trigger the creature's attack instincts. The security officers behind him were screaming warnings about the creature's toxic saliva and bone-crushing jaw strength. Professor Zethkar was shouting something about evacuation protocols and emergency procedures, but Jake filtered out the noise and focused entirely on the Nexus stalker. The creature took another step forward, and Jake could smell its breath. It was like hot metal mixed with sulfur, the scent of a world where volcanoes never stopped erupting. The creature's saliva continued to drip, but Jake noticed that it was not actively trying to spit at him or spray acid in his direction. Jake reached slowly into his pocket, moving his hand with the same careful precision he had used when feeding wild deer as a child. His fingers found the protein bar he had brought for lunch, still wrapped in its biodegradable packaging. He pulled it out gradually, keeping his movements smooth and non-threatening. The Nexus stalker's red eyes focused on the protein bar with sudden interest. Its nostrils flared, and Jake realized the creature was analyzing the scent of the food. The beast had probably not eaten recently, and hunger might be driving its aggressive behavior more than pure predatory instinct. Jake unwrapped the protein bar with slow, deliberate movements, keeping his eyes on the creature's face. The Nexus stalker's head followed every motion, but its aggressive posture began to relax slightly. The creature was still dangerous, but it was no longer preparing to attack. "Easy there," Jake said in a low, calm voice. His father had always told him that tone was more important than words when dealing with animals. "You're just hungry, aren't you? Nobody's going to hurt you." The creature's ears, which Jake had not noticed before, twitched at the sound of his voice. They were small and pointed, almost hidden among the scales on its head. The Nexus stalker tilted its head again, studying Jake with what looked like curiosity rather than aggression. Jake broke off a small piece of the protein bar and held it out toward the creature, his palm flat and open. The Nexus stalker sniffed the air, its red eyes moving between Jake's face and the food in his hand. The creature took a cautious step forward, then another. Behind Jake, the classroom had fallen completely silent. The security officers had stopped shouting, Professor Zethkar had stopped clicking, and even the building's alarm system seemed to have paused. Everyone was watching the impossible scene unfold before them. The Nexus stalker stretched its neck forward, moving with the careful precision of a cat approaching an uncertain situation. Its breath was hot against Jake's palm, and he could feel the creature's saliva dripping near his fingers. But he held perfectly still, letting the predator make its own decision about whether to trust him. The creature's tongue, which was longer and more flexible than Jake had expected, reached out and delicately lifted the piece of protein bar from his palm. The Nexus stalker pulled back slightly and chewed the food with obvious enjoyment, its red eyes never leaving Jake's face. Jake smiled and broke off another piece of the protein bar. See? That wasn't so bad. You're not a monster, are you? You're just scared and hungry and far from home. The creature's entire posture changed. Its aggressive stance melted away, replaced by something that looked almost like relief. The Nexus stalker moved closer to Jake, no longer stalking but simply approaching. Like a larger, unusual dog that had found a friendly human. Jake reached out slowly and touched the creature's head, just behind what he thought might be its ears. The Nexus stalker's scales were warm and surprisingly smooth, like touching a rock that had been sitting in the sun. The creature made a sound that Jake had never heard before, a deep rumbling that seemed to come from its chest. The sound was pure contentment, and Jake realized with amazement that the deadly predator was purring. The silence in the classroom stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Jake continued to scratch behind the Nexus stalker's ears while the creature purred with deep satisfaction. The sound filled the room like the rumbling of a distant earthquake, but somehow it was comforting rather than threatening. Professor Zethkar was the first to find his voice. His mandibles clicked hesitantly as he spoke, and Jake could hear uncertainty in every word. "Student Martinez, could you please explain what training you received for handling Class 5 predatory specimens?" Jake looked up from the creature, confused by the question. "Training? I didn't get any special training. I just used common sense." He gave the Nexus stalker another gentle scratch, and the purring grew louder. "My dad taught me how to deal with dangerous animals when I was a kid." The professor's compound eyes focused more intently on Jake. "What specialized equipment are you using to neutralize the creature's aggressive response patterns?" "Equipment?" Jake shook his head. "I'm not using any equipment. I just gave it some food and showed it I wasn't a threat. Animals usually calm down when they realize you're not trying to hurt them." Veltara's voice came from near the exit, where she had retreated during the panic. Her starlight skin was still dim with fear, but curiosity was beginning to overcome her terror. "How did you know the creature's behavioral patterns? What database did you access for predator psychology information?" Jake felt even more confused. "I didn't access any database. I just watched how it moved and tried to understand what it wanted. It was acting like a scared, hungry animal, so I treated it like one." One of the security officers stepped forward, his weapon still drawn but no longer pointed at the Nexus stalker. "What neutralization agents did you deploy?" "The scanner readings show no chemical suppressants or electromagnetic dampening fields." "I don't know what any of those things are," Jake admitted. "I just offered it food and spoke calmly. That's what you do with upset animals." Professor Zethkar moved closer, his forelegs carrying him with careful steps. The Nexus stalker looked up at the approaching insectoid but showed no signs of aggression. It seemed perfectly content to stay near Jake and accept the gentle scratching behind its ears. "Student Martinez, you mentioned that your father taught you to handle dangerous animals. What kind of specialized facility did he operate? What level of containment protocols did you learn?" Jake laughed, which made several students jump nervously. "My dad wasn't a scientist or anything. He was just a park ranger in Colorado. He taught me about wildlife because we lived in the mountains where there were bears and mountain lions and stuff." The classroom fell silent again. Jake could see the alien students exchanging glances that he could not interpret, but their body language suggested they were having trouble understanding something basic. Crex's crystal form had stopped vibrating, and he was humming in a tone that Jake's translator suggested meant confusion. "You learned to handle predators as a child, on your homeworld? As part of normal development?" "Well, yeah," Jake said. "Pretty much every kid who grows up in rural areas learns basic wildlife safety. You have to know how to deal with dangerous animals because they're everywhere. Scylla had emerged from under her chair, her tentacles moving in slow, uncertain patterns. Her skin was shifting between colors that Jake could not identify, but her voice sounded amazed. Everywhere? Your world has dangerous predators in common areas where children live? Jake nodded, still scratching the Nexus stalker's head. Bears? Mountain lions, wolves, rattlesnakes, coyotes. Lots of stuff that can hurt you if you don't know what you're doing. But it's not that hard to avoid problems if you understand how they think. Professor Zethkar's mandibles began clicking rapidly, and Jake realized the professor was accessing some kind of database through his neural interface. After a moment, the clicking stopped, and the professor's compound eyes widened in what Jake thought might be shock. According to the Galactic Biological Survey, Professor Zethkar said slowly, your homeworld of Earth contains over 40 species that would be classified as extreme threat level in standard galactic safety protocols. The survey notes that these creatures coexist with human settlements and that humans routinely encounter them without protective equipment. Jake shrugged. That sounds about right. We don't usually need protection unless we're going into really dangerous areas. Most animals leave you alone if you don't bother them. Valtara's voice was barely a whisper. You said wolves. The survey mentions that humans' domesticated creatures descended from pack hunters with bite forces exceeding 1,500 pounds per square inch. Is this accurate? You mean dogs? Jake asked. Yeah, dogs are descended from wolves. My family has 3 of them. They're great pets. Really loyal and friendly once they bond with you? The translator system struggled for a moment before Krex's response came through as pure mathematical confusion. Your species keeps pack hunters as companions in your homes? Near your offspring? Jake was beginning to understand that something about his normal life was shocking to these aliens, but he still could not figure out what. Dogs aren't dangerous if you raise them right. They're protective of their families, but they're not aggressive toward people they trust. Professor Zethkar accessed his database again, and this time his clicking sounded like alarm bells. The survey indicates that Earth's atmospheric oxygen content is nearly toxic to most galactic species, that gravity exceeds safe limits for 89% of known civilizations, and that the planet experiences regular natural disasters including earthquakes, hurricanes, volcanic eruptions, and temperature extremes that would require emergency evacuation protocols. That's just normal weather. Jake said, you learn to deal with it. Humans are pretty adaptable. Scylla's tentacles were moving in rapid spirals, and her skin had turned a bright orange that Jake's translator suggested meant amazement. Your species evolved in conditions that we would classify as uninhabitable. Yet you describe these conditions as normal childhood experiences. The Nexus stalker had grown bored with the conversation and was now exploring Jake's pockets, looking for more food. Jake pulled out another protein bar and fed pieces of it to the creature while the alien students watched in fascination. I'm starting to understand why you call us Deathworlders, Jake said. Earth must seem pretty dangerous to species that evolved on safer planets. Professor Zethkar's mandibles clicked with what Jake was learning to recognize as academic excitement, mixed with fear. Student Martinez, what you call normal childhood experiences would require advanced military training and specialized equipment for any other species in the galaxy. Your casual interaction with a Class 5 predator represents skills that we do not fully comprehend. Jake looked around the room at the alien students, all of whom were staring at him with expressions that ranged from awe to terror. He was beginning to realize that his ordinary human upbringing had prepared him for challenges that these advanced civilizations could not even imagine. The Nexus stalker finished the protein bar and settled down next to Jake's feet, still purring contentedly. Jake reached down to pet the creature's head, and it leaned into his touch like a cat seeking affection. I guess we're just used to living with things that want to kill us, Jake said simply. It makes you pretty good at staying alive. 3 hours after the incident, Jake sat in the Academy's main courtyard with the Nexus stalker sleeping peacefully beside him. The creature had refused to return to any containment unit and seemed determined to stay close to the only being in the galaxy that had shown it kindness. Jake did not mind the company, and the security officers had decided that the situation was stable enough to allow it. Word of what had happened spread through Centauri Prime Academy faster than wildfire. Students from every species gathered in small groups throughout the courtyard, all of them staring at Jake and whispering in languages that his translator could not keep up with. Some kept their distance, clearly still afraid of the Nexus stalker, while others approached cautiously to get a better look at the human who had tamed. A Class 5 predator. Dr. Elena Rodriguez arrived on the evening transport from the human embassy. She was a small woman with gray hair and kind eyes, but Jake could see the concern in her expression as she walked toward him across the courtyard. Behind her came 3 other humans that Jake recognized as senior staff from the exchange program. "Jake," Dr. Rodriguez said as she sat down on the bench beside him, "are you hurt?" The report we received was somewhat difficult to believe. Jake shook his head. "I'm fine. The creature never tried to hurt me. It was just scared and hungry." He gestured toward the sleeping Nexus stalker. "Look at it now. It's just like a big, weird dog." Dr. Rodriguez studied the creature with the careful attention of someone who had spent decades working with alien species. "Jake, do you understand what happened today? What it means for the other students and faculty here?" "Not really," Jake admitted. "Everyone keeps acting like I did something impossible, but I just treated it like any other animal. I don't see what the big deal is." One of the other humans, a tall man named Dr. Williams, sat down across from them. "Jake, most species in the galaxy evolved on what we call garden worlds. Planets with stable climates, few natural disasters, and relatively peaceful ecosystems. They've never had to develop the survival skills that humans take for granted." "Doctor," Rodriguez nodded. "When they look at you, they see someone who can do things they've been taught are impossible. You handled a creature that their safety protocols classify as requiring military intervention." Jake looked around the courtyard at the alien students who were still watching him. "Is that why they keep calling me a Deathworlder? Because Earth is more dangerous than their planets?" "Much more dangerous," Dr. Williams confirmed. "Earth's gravity alone would crush most of these species. The oxygen content would poison them. The weather patterns would require constant shelter and protection. And the wildlife—" He gestured toward the Nexus stalker. "Earth has thousands of species that are more dangerous than this creature." Professor Zethkar approached their group, his 4 legs carrying him with careful dignity. His compound eyes reflected the courtyard's lights as he bowed in the formal greeting style of his species. "Dr. Rodriguez, I must apologize for the incident in my classroom. Our safety protocols clearly failed to account for the unique capabilities of human students," Dr. Rodriguez smiled. "Professor, from what I understand, Jake handled the situation better than anyone could have expected." "There's no need for apologies?" The professor's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. "Indeed, student Martinez displayed abilities that we are only beginning to understand. I have been reviewing the literature on Deathworld evolution, and I believe we have significantly underestimated the practical implications of human development." Jake felt uncomfortable being discussed as if he were not there. "I really didn't do anything special. Any kid who grew up in the mountains could have handled that situation." Professor Zethkar's compound eyes focused on Jake with intense interest. "That statement itself demonstrates the gap in our understanding. What you consider normal childhood preparation would represent advanced specialization for most galactic species." Over the next hour, more faculty members arrived to observe Jake and the sleeping Nexus stalker. They came from every department in the academy, representing dozens of different species and academic disciplines. They spoke in quiet voices and took careful notes, but Jake could feel their amazement and curiosity. Valtara finally worked up the courage to approach, her starlight skin still dimmer than usual. "Jake, may I ask you something? When you saw the creature break free, were you not afraid?" Jake considered the question. "I was alert, but not really afraid. Fear makes you do stupid things around dangerous animals. My dad always said that saying. Calm was the most important skill for surviving in the wilderness." "Your father taught survival skills to children?" Veltara's silver eyes widened. On purpose? Of course, Jake said. How else would we learn to be safe? Kids need to know what to do if they meet a bear or get lost in the woods. It's basic education. Silenth joined the conversation, her tentacles moving in patterns that Jake was beginning to recognize as curiosity. What other survival skills did you learn as a child? Jake thought about it. Fire starting, water purification, shelter building, weather prediction, plant identification, first aid, navigation without technology, hunting, fishing, food preservation. He paused. Pretty standard stuff for outdoor education. The alien students exchanged glances that Jake could not interpret. Krex's crystal form hummed with a tone that suggested amazement. These skills are taught to all human children? Not all, Jake corrected. Mostly just kids who grow up in rural areas or whose families like outdoor activities. But it's pretty common. Dr. Rodriguez had been listening to the conversation with growing understanding. Jake, I think the Academy would benefit from learning about these skills. Would you be interested in sharing your knowledge with other students? Professor Zethkar's mandibles clicked with enthusiasm. An excellent suggestion. We could establish a new course in practical survival techniques. Student Martinez could serve as the primary instructor. Jake looked around at the gathered aliens, all of whom were watching him with expressions of hope and fascination. The idea of teaching was appealing, but he still felt strange about being considered an expert in something he thought was basic knowledge. I could try, Jake said slowly, but I don't understand why my normal life experiences are so interesting to everyone. Dr. Williams smiled. Jake, you have to understand that what's normal for humans is miraculous for most other species. You represent capabilities that they've never encountered before? The Nexus Stalker stirred beside Jake, opening one red eye and looking around the courtyard. The creature seemed perfectly content to be surrounded by dozens of alien students as long as Jake remained nearby. It yawned, showing its impressive teeth, then settled back down for another nap. Look at that, Dr. Rodriguez said quietly. A creature that required military-grade containment protocols is now sleeping peacefully in a public courtyard because one human showed it kindness and understanding. Jake reached down to scratch behind the creature's ears, and the purring started again. Around the courtyard, alien students leaned forward to hear the sound better, their faces filled with wonder. 3 weeks later, Jake stood in front of a classroom that was packed beyond capacity. Students sat on the floor, floated near the ceiling, and pressed against the walls. The course listing had simply read, Practical Survival Techniques for Galactic Citizens. But word had spread throughout the Academy about the human who could tame predators with food and patience. Today we're going to start with basic animal psychology, Jake said, looking out at the sea of alien faces. The first thing you need to understand is that most aggressive behavior comes from fear, hunger, or the need to protect territory or offspring. The Nexus Stalker, who had become Jake's unofficial teaching assistant, demonstrated by rolling over and exposing its belly in a gesture of complete trust. The alien students took careful notes, treating every word as if it contained the secrets of the universe. Jake smiled as he realized that his simple mountain upbringing had prepared him not just for survival on Earth, but for becoming a bridge between humanity and the wider galaxy. His father had taught him to respect nature and understand animals, but he had never imagined that these lessons would make him one of the most valuable teachers in galactic education. As he began his first lesson, Jake understood that he was not just teaching survival skills. He was showing the galaxy what humans could offer to the community of worlds, one lesson at a time.